Imagine discovering that 4,500 years ago, someone connected to your family stood on Salisbury Plain, watching an enormous stone rise into the sky. You would not know their name. You would not recognize their language. They had no surname to search in a parish register, no nationality that would fit neatly into a modern DNA result, and no written family history waiting to be discovered. But thousands of years later, scientists recovered something people from their world never knew they would leave behind: biological evidence preserved in ancient human remains. And what it revealed transformed our understanding of the populations living in Britain when Stonehenge was created. So could any part of their story have survived all the way to you? The question sounds almost impossible. Stonehenge belongs to a world so distant that even imagining a family connection feels extraordinary. Yet the deeper researchers investigate prehistoric Britain, the stranger the story becomes. There was never one unchanging population living here from the Stone Age to the present. People arrived, communities mixed, populations expanded and declined, and entire identities disappeared. During the centuries in which Stonehenge itself was transformed, Britain experienced profound demographic changes. That leaves us with four mysteries: who actually created Stonehenge? Where had their ancestors come from? What happened to those populations afterwards? And could ancestry connected to people living in Stonehenge-era Britain survive in families today? There is another complication. The people who began Stonehenge and those alive when its most famous stones were raised were separated by generations. Stonehenge was not one construction project completed according to a single blueprint. It developed over centuries as different generations inherited the same landscape and changed it. And while the monument was changing, the population of Britain was changing too. To understand what that means, we have to follow several kinds of evidence. Archaeology can show us how people lived and where materials traveled. Human remains can reveal clues about diet and mobility. Ancient DNA can expose population movements invisible to written history. Genealogy can then help us understand something genetics alone cannot: why the decline of a population's distinctive genetic ancestry does not necessarily mean every family belonging to that population had no descendants. By the end of this investigation, we will confront the question directly. Not whether a DNA company can hand you a certificate declaring that your ancestor built Stonehenge. It cannot. But whether the anonymous families who created and used one of the world's most famous monuments truly disappeared. If uncovering the hidden history behind British ancestry is your kind of mystery, subscribe to UK Bloodlines and tell us where your oldest British family line comes from. Now remove the roads, visitor centre and crowds from Salisbury Plain. Remove England itself. Travel backwards more than 5,000 years, and the landscape becomes unfamiliar, but the people do not have to remain faceless. Across Neolithic Britain, communities cultivated crops and kept livestock. People built homes, made tools, exchanged materials and travelled between regions. They buried their dead and gathered at places that clearly carried meanings beyond everyday survival. Their lives followed seasons, harvests, births and deaths. Relationships, memory and family mattered. Imagine a settlement waking on a cold morning. Smoke rises from a fire while someone prepares food and another checks livestock. A damaged tool needs repairing. Children watch adults work and learn skills they may eventually pass to their own children. Travelers bring objects, information, and perhaps stories from communities beyond the horizon. Somewhere, someone remembers a relative who died years earlier. We cannot reconstruct one particular morning exactly like this at Stonehenge, but thinking in human terms corrects one of the greatest distortions in the way we imagine prehistory. These were not mysterious Stone Age people waiting for civilization to begin. They were parents, children, farmers, travelers, and craftspeople living inside social worlds every bit as real to them as ours is to us. Nor were they completely isolated. Materials moved across considerable distances, ideas traveled, and people gathered, exchanged goods, and maintained relationships between communities. Certain places became associated with burial, ceremony, and collective activity, and Salisbury Plain developed within this wider prehistoric landscape. Underneath everything we have just described, however, is a question that would eventually transform the Stonehenge story. Where had these people themselves come from? Travel backwards through a British family tree and familiar identities begin falling away. Norman disappears, then Viking, Anglo-Saxon and Roman. Even labels such as Celtic eventually become inadequate for the populations we are discussing. Continue backwards, and you reach people living before England existed, before written British history, and before almost every identity and families used to describe themselves. That is the world in which Stonehenge began. The monument visible today can mislead us. Standing before its enormous stones, it is easy to imagine hundreds of people arriving with a plan and constructing Stonehenge, one extraordinary prehistoric project. The archaeology tells a much longer story. Stonehenge developed through multiple phases. Earlier earthworks and features preceded the monumental stone arrangements people recognize today. The landscape was revisited and altered across generations. Stones were introduced and rearranged, while practices surrounding the site changed. We should be careful about claiming exactly what Stonehenge meant. Researchers have explored connections with burial, ceremony, seasonal gatherings, astronomical alignments, social relationships, and other possibilities. Some interpretations may overlap, and the precise beliefs of the people who used Stonehenge remain beyond our ability to recover completely. But one conclusion is difficult to escape. People kept returning. Imagine being a child and seeing an earlier Stonehenge. Decades pass, you return as an adult, and something has changed. Another generation inherits the monument and alters it again. Eventually children grow up beside a Stonehenge their grandparents would not have recognized in exactly the same form. The stones seem permanent to us because we encounter the surviving monument frozen in time. To prehistoric communities, Stonehenge may instead have been something inherited, remembered, and repeatedly transformed. And that creates our next problem. If Stonehenge changed across generations, were the people building and using it changing as well? One clue comes from the stones themselves. Some of Stonehenge's smaller stones, commonly called bluestones, have geological connections to West Wales, particularly the Preseli region. Their presence on Salisbury Plain creates an astonishing geographical problem. Somehow, stone material associated with Wales reached a monument roughly 140 miles away as the crow flies, with actual prehistoric roots potentially considerably longer. Researchers continue to debate aspects of how particular stones made that journey. Human transport has been extensively investigated, while precise routes and methods remain uncertain. We should not pretend we can reconstruct the journey like a recorded historical event. But whatever the exact route, the distance tells us something important. Stonehenge belonged to a connected world. Then there were the much larger Sarsens. Research has linked most of Stonehenge's surviving giant Sarsens to the westwards area of the Marlborough Downs. That journey was shorter than the connection with West Wales, but moving stones weighing many tons remained an enormous logistical challenge. Imagine attempting it without an engine, steel cable, or modern crane. Ropes tighten around a massive stone, while timber is prepared and people take their positions. Someone has to coordinate the effort. Others must provide food. Tools need maintaining. Rain changes the ground beneath their feet. A slope that looks harmless becomes dangerous when tons of stone begin moving. The exact engineering techniques remain debated, and researchers have proposed methods involving sledges, timber, ropes, and prepared routes. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that organized groups, using relatively simple technologies, can move remarkable weights. But perhaps our obsession with how the stones moved has distracted us from a greater mystery. How did you move the people? Stonehenge required cooperation, knowledge passed between generations, and communities capable of organizing and supporting labor. Because the monument developed over such a long period, it also required people repeatedly deciding that this landscape mattered. What could persuade communities to participate in something whose future they might never live to see? Religion, ancestors, political authority, seasonal gathering, and social alliances have all formed part of attempts to understand prehistoric monuments, perhaps alongside ideas for which we no longer possess an adequate modern word. The precise answer remains debated, but surrounding the stones was another form of evidence capable of bringing us closer to the people themselves, the dead. Human remains and burials associated with Stonehenge and its wider landscape reveal that this was never merely an engineering site. Cremated human remains were deposited at Stonehenge during its earlier history, while burial monuments spread across the surrounding landscape. Bones and teeth can preserve clues that stones cannot. Chemical signatures within human remains can help researchers investigate diet and mobility. Isotope analysis, for example, can sometimes indicate whether an individual grew up in an environment geologically different from the place where they were buried. It does not provide a prehistoric postcode, and interpretations require caution, but combined with archaeology, It can reveal movements that would otherwise remain invisible. Research involving cremated remains from Stonehenge has contributed to evidence of connections extending towards Western Britain, including Wales. That does not mean researchers can point to a particular burial and declare that this person transported a particular bluestone. Someone buried at Stonehenge was not automatically a builder, and someone who travelled from Wales was not automatically a stone transporter. The broader pattern is what matters. People moved, materials moved, and Stonehenge was connected to communities far beyond Salisbury Plain. Then researchers gained access to another archive preserved within ancient human remains, DNA. For generations, archaeologists faced a difficult problem. If pottery styles changed or new burial traditions appeared, did that mean new people had arrived, or had existing populations simply adopted new customs? Material culture and biological ancestry are not the same thing. A pot cannot tell you someone's genome, and the genetic profile cannot tell you everything that person believed. Ancient DNA therefore gave researchers another way to investigate prehistoric population history. DNA degrades after death, and recovering reliable ancient genetic information requires careful methods to control contamination and damage. But advances in archaeogenetics have allowed scientists to compare prehistoric individuals from Britain with populations elsewhere in Europe. The results revealed a Britain that had already experienced major population change before Stonehenge reached its most famous form. The Neolithic farming populations of Britain were not simply an unchanged continuation of the hunter-gatherer populations that had occupied Britain after the Ice Age. Much of their ancestry was connected to farming populations, whose deeper origins ultimately traced towards early farmers from Anatolia. Across many generations, farming populations expanded through Europe and mixed to varying degrees with hunter-gatherer groups along the way. Farming eventually reached Britain as part of that enormous human story. Think about what that means. Thousands of years before Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, or Normans, Britain was already being reshaped by migration. The people we sometimes imagine as Britain's original inhabitants had ancestors who had moved too. Ancient Britain was never a sealed container. And while generations were transforming Stonehenge, another demographic transformation was approaching, one so substantial that it forces us to reconsider what it even means for an ancient population to survive. When you imagine your ancient British ancestors, where does your imagination normally stop? Perhaps Roman Britain, the Iron Age or the Bronze Age, now travel further back, before those identities existed, to people who would not have recognized any modern British surname, nationality or ethnic label. During the 3rd millennium BC, populations associated archaeologically with the bell beaker phenomenon appeared in Britain. The name comes partly from distinctive bell-shaped pottery found across regions of prehistoric Europe, but we must avoid turning an archaeological label into a single tribe or ethnicity. Bell beaker-associated communities varied, and pottery does not equal DNA. Genetics, however, revealed that in Britain this period was associated with profound demographic change. Over the centuries following the arrival of bell beaker-associated groups, ancestry characteristic of Britain's earlier Neolithic populations declined dramatically, while ancestry connected to incoming populations carrying substantial step-related ancestry became dominant. The scale of that transformation is one of the most striking discoveries ancient DNA has made about prehistoric Britain, but this is where dramatic storytelling can easily become bad history. It does not mean an army arrived one afternoon and exterminated every person connected to Stonehenge's earlier communities. Genetic turnover describes changes in populations across generations. Migration, fertility, mortality, marriage patterns, social structures and potentially other factors can all influence what later populations look like genetically. The exact human processes behind Britain's transformation remain more complicated than a single word, such as conquest or replacement, can explain. Imagine Salisbury Plain during those changing centuries. Stonehenge is still there, but new people are entering Britain's population history. Relationships form. Children inherit ancestry from parents whose deeper family histories may lead towards very different parts of Europe. Customs change and networks change. Nobody standing there understands that a demographic transformation is occurring. They are simply living. Thousands of years later, DNA exposes the consequences. But if ancestry associated with Britain's Neolithic populations declined so dramatically, did the family lines of the people connected with early Stonehenge disappear too? This is where our original question becomes harder and far more interesting, Because population ancestry and genealogical ancestry are not exactly the same thing. Imagine your family tree expanding backwards. You have two biological parents, up to 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents. Continue far enough and the simple doubling pattern breaks down, because ancestral lines overlap. Distant relatives share ancestors and populations are finite. But the number of genealogical connections still becomes enormous. DNA behaves differently. You receive roughly half your autosomal DNA from each parent, but that DNA is shuffled through recombination in every generation. Travel sufficiently far backwards, and you can have a genuine genealogical ancestor from whom you inherited no uniquely identifiable autosomal DNA segment that survives in you today. Picture a vast tapestry repeatedly repaired and rewoven. Every generation adds threads from different families. After hundreds of generations, an ancient person's family line might still belong somewhere, a history of that tapestry, even though you can no longer point to one surviving thread and confidently declare that it came from that exact individual. The analogy is imperfect, but the distinction is crucial. Genealogical ancestry describes relationships of descent. Genetic ancestry describes inherited biological material. Across sufficiently deep time, they are not identical records. This changes the Stonehenge question completely. A population can experience enormous genetic turnover without allowing us to conclude that every genealogical line from the earlier population ended. Some certainly did. Countless people throughout history left no descendants. Other lines may have continued, but become increasingly absorbed into later populations through intermarriage. Their descendants could eventually belong culturally and genetically to populations very different from those of their distant ancestors. So when someone asks whether the Stonehenge people disappeared, the answer depends on what disappear means. Their Neolithic genetic profile did not remain unchanged, their cultural world did not remain unchanged, and the identities by which they understood themselves eventually disappeared. But those facts alone cannot demonstrate that every genealogical family line ended. And this is precisely why ancient DNA makes the story more interesting rather than less. Before we follow those family lines forward, tell us in the comments, how far back have you actually traced your British ancestry? 100 years, 300, 500, or even further? Now stand beside Stonehenge and accelerate time. The people who personally knew its builders disappear from living memory. Children become parents, grandchildren become ancestors, and stories change. Britain moves through the Bronze Age as metalworking, exchange networks and social practices develop. Generations inherit monuments whose original creators are becoming increasingly distant. Centuries later, Iron Age communities occupy a Britain of farms, settlements and hill forts. Languages and identities change. The people who first marked out Stonehenge would belong to a world almost unimaginably remote. Then Roman armies enter Britain. Roads cross the landscape and towns develop. Soldiers, merchants, administrators and families from different parts of the Roman world become part of Britain's population story. By then, Stonehenge is already ancient, Rome eventually withdraws, and new migrations and political transformations follow. Anglo-Saxon settlement contributes another major layer to Britain's ancestry and language. Scandinavian raiders arrive, followed by settlement in parts of Britain. Kingdoms rise and fall. Then Norman armies cross the Channel in 1066. Empires change, languages change, religions change, and identities change, while across Salisbury Plain, the stones remain and families continue. This is the clue historical labels can make us forget. We describe populations as Neolithic farmers, Bell Beaker-associated people, Iron Age Britons, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and Normans, because categories help us understand history. But ancestry does not move through time in labeled boxes. It moves through parents and children. A woman from one community has children with a man whose family came from another. Their descendants marry again. A century passes, then 5 centuries, and eventually nobody remembers the original distinction. Here is perhaps the strangest ancestry clue of all. If someone living today really did have a genealogical ancestor who witnessed Stonehenge being raised, that ancestor almost certainly would not possess the identity the modern descendant is searching for. There would be no matching surname, no English nationality, no clan tartan, and no medieval coat of arms. Perhaps they would not even have spoken a language from the same branch as the one their descendant speaks today. The deeper we travel into ancestry, the less our modern labels survive. Your surname is young compared with Stonehenge. Even an exceptionally old British surname, documented in medieval records, begins thousands of years after the principal prehistoric phases of the monument. Parish registers take us back only a fraction of the distance. Medieval documents eventually thin out and written records disappear. Conventional genealogy reaches a wall. DNA can see beyond part of that wall, but it sees something different. Ancient DNA can reconstruct relationships between populations and, in exceptional archaeological contexts, reveal biological relationships between ancient individuals. It can demonstrate that Britain's population history was repeatedly reshaped. What it usually cannot do is construct a documented parent-to-child chain from an unnamed person living around Stonehenge the 3rd millennium BC. Commercial ancestry testing does not solve that problem. There is no Stonehenge gene, and no ethnicity percentage can certify that one of your ancestors erected a sarsen. Comparing DNA with ancient populations can illuminate broad genetic affinities and population history, but that is fundamentally different from proving that a particular ancient individual was your genealogical ancestor. That distinction may sound like a limitation, but it protects us from turning fascinating science into a family myth. Think about your oldest documented ancestor. Perhaps you know their occupation, their village, or even the house where they lived. Now imagine another 100 generations behind that person. Those generations are not empty spaces on a family tree. They contain people whose names are lost forever, and whose faces were never recorded. People who migrated, married, survived hardship, raised children, and became ancestors without ever knowing that thousands of years later someone might search for them. Historically, then, could modern people with sufficiently deep ancestry, connected to Britain and neighbouring populations, possess genealogical connections to people who lived here during the Stonehenge-era? Across thousands of years, family trees become extraordinarily interconnected, making such connections historically plausible. But can we demonstrate that one particular Stonehenge builder is your ancestor? Almost certainly not. Can a commercial DNA test prove it? No. And yet this does not make the investigation disappointing. It makes it bigger. Stonehenge's people were not mythological figures. They belonged to real populations whose histories are becoming increasingly visible through archaeology and genetics. Their own ancestors had migrated. Their communities formed long-distance connections. Their world underwent enormous demographic change. Some genealogical lines from prehistoric populations may have persisted even while the overall genetic landscape transformed around them. The responsible answer is therefore neither yes, your ancestor built Stonehenge, nor no, those families all disappeared. The evidence gives us something more complicated and more fascinating. There is one final clue most people overlook. If you genuinely want to connect your documented family history with Britain's deeper past, do not begin by forcing a surname backwards towards Stonehenge. Begin with place. Find where your documented ancestors actually lived, whether that was a parish, valley, county, border region, or coastal community. Then ask what archaeology reveals about that landscape, how populations moved through the region, and what ancient DNA tells us about the broader population history. Follow historical migrations forward until written genealogy becomes available. Place, genealogy, archaeology, and genetics work best together. None can prove on its own that your ancestor built Stonehenge. Together they can produce something much more valuable, an evidence-based picture of the human worlds through which your family story eventually emerged. One clue rarely proves deep ancestry. Multiple independent forms of evidence create the strongest historical picture. Now return to Salisbury Plain one last time. The sun is rising, and at first the stones are only dark shapes against the horizon. Slowly their edges appear. Thousands of tourists will look at those stones and see a monument, but try instead to see the people, hands tightening around ropes, feet pressing into wet earth, someone calling instructions, someone exhausted, someone carrying food towards the workers, children watching, a traveller arriving after days on the road, someone nursing an injured hand, and someone laughing beside a fire. Perhaps a parent lifts a child high enough to see over the crowd. Perhaps an elderly person watches younger people continue work begun before some of them were born. We cannot know that those individual moments happened exactly that way, and we should never pretend imagination is evidence. But people were there. They did not know they were prehistoric, and they did not call themselves Stonehenge builders. They could never have imagined archaeologists analyzing their world thousands of years later, or scientists recovering ancient DNA and reconstructing migrations that even they did not know had shaped their ancestry. They were simply alive. Parents had children. Some children died young, while others survived and had families of their own. Some family lines ended, and others continued. New populations arrived, communities mixed. Languages disappeared, and identities changed. Nothing remained pure or untouched, because human history does not work that way. Yet generation followed generation, and perhaps that is why the question, could your family have built Stonehenge, is more profound than it first appears. It sounds like a question about a monument, but it is really a question about survival. How far can a family continue after every name, story and identity that once defined it has disappeared? If you know where your oldest British family line begins in the records, share the place and how far back you've traced it, and subscribe to UK Bloodlines for our next ancestry investigation. Then imagine the people at Stonehenge once more. They could not leave us surnames or photographs, and most could not leave words that we can read. Stone remembers differently from people. Names disappear, languages vanish, and family stories eventually fall silent. Even DNA becomes harder to connect to individual ancestors across enough generations. But every person alive today stands at the end of an unimaginably long chain of human lives. Somewhere in Britain's prehistoric landscape were people whose names we will never know, whose children had children, and whose descendants watched newcomers arrive and old worlds disappear. Some branches of those families ended. Others may have continued into populations carrying languages and identities their distant ancestors could never have imagined. Can science prove that one of those people wrapped their hands around a rope on Salisbury Plain, helped raise a stone, and eventually became your ancestor? No, but perhaps Stonehenge's greatest mystery is no longer simply who built it. Perhaps it is how much of their world still survives, in the landscape, in the population history of Britain, and possibly somewhere among the countless forgotten branches that eventually led to us. The stones survived, perhaps some of their families did too.